The horrible death of King Henry VIII. What if I told you that one of history's most powerful monarchs, who once commanded nations and executed wives without hesitation, died in agony, his body unrecognizable, leaking fluids that were consumed by stray dogs? Would you believe me? This is the story of Henry VIII's final days, a death so horrifying that even his closest courtiers dared not speak of it, for fear that the very stench of his decline would taint their legacy. How did a king, once celebrated as Europe's most virile and majestic ruler, end up so utterly destroyed by his own body? Henry VIII, once the most feared man in Christendom, was reduced to a bloated, diseased corpse, almost unrecognizable to those who had once knelt before him. His once celebrated strength, his towering presence, his fierce grip on power, shattered. How did this man, who had once reshaped England's religion, who defied the Pope and sent wives to the scaffold, descend into a grotesque parody of himself? And more chilling still, how did his final days become a disgusting spectacle of disease, decay, and paranoia? In this documentary, we will dive deep into the hidden corners of Henry's final years. We'll reveal shocking truths that have been buried in the mists of time. The poisonous combination of physical torment, mental instability, and the dark forces at court that sealed his horrific fate. From an accident that would change him forever to a monstrous death nobody dared speak of, this is the true story of Henry VIII's end, and it's far more repulsive than history has ever dared admit. Brace yourself for a journey that will unearth the sickening realities behind the death of a king, once mighty and revered, who was ultimately consumed by the very flesh that had once held his power. The rise of a king, the Golden Prince. Imagine a once great monarch, one who was revered, feared, and admired across Europe, so decayed by disease that, by the time of his death, his bloated corpse could hardly be recognized as human. His body oozed fluids in a poorly sealed coffin, a grotesque spectacle in the royal chapel, as dogs feasted on the mess he left behind. And this was the fate of the man who defied Rome, executed wives, and rebuilt a nation in his own image. But this isn't the end of Henry VIII's story. It's the beginning of his true horror. Who killed him? Not with a sword or poison, but with something far more insidious: his own mind. In 1491, Henry VIII was born the second son to King Henry VII, a man whose reign was defined by insecurity and caution. Young Henry, in contrast, was the living embodiment of Renaissance ideals: athletic, charming, and brilliant. He inherited not just the throne in 1509, but a legacy of ambition and an empire that he felt was destined to be shaped by his indomitable will. However, this ambitious youth, who once jousted, danced, and sang with the best of them, would never experience the true glory of his youth again. A series of disastrous decisions and personal failings would leave him a shell of the man he was, physically broken and mentally fractured. But the question remains: how did a king who had it all, who nearly toppled the church and reshaped England, fall so far? Did Henry's downfall truly begin with his break from Rome? Or was it his relentless obsession with securing a son that set in motion the fatal chain of events that would lead to his grotesque death? Henry VIII wasn't just a king, he was a Renaissance ideal come to life. He was the perfect monarch, known across Europe for his athleticism, looks, and sharp mind. A powerful force in both politics and military strategy, he seemed destined to lead England into an age of glory. But at what cost? With a crown on his head, Henry's desire for absolute control became his undoing. Why did he marry 6 times? Was it merely his desire for an heir? Or was it something deeper, a psychological obsession with legacy, with defeating the one thing that could threaten his reign? Time itself? His first marriage to Catherine of Aragon began as a political alliance, but as he aged, Henry's need for validation intensified. Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, and the others were mere stepping stones in his effort to create a perfect dynasty. But his body, the one thing he once relied upon to project power and masculinity, began to fail him. What happens when a king who once ruled with fear and authority is no longer the powerful figure he once was? Could his obsession with securing an heir have been the true cause of his demise? In 1529, Henry's life took a sharp, irreversible turn. An accident while jousting left him unconscious for hours, and when he awoke, he was no longer the vibrant young king who had once inspired awe across Europe. His body began to rebel, first with a wound that wouldn't heal, then with ulcers and an illness that sapped his strength. The psychological impact of this accident was far worse than anyone realized. Not only was his health deteriorating, but his fears of being forgotten, of being displaced by his children, haunted him. His paranoia grew. The failure of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the death of Anne Boleyn, and the birth of Elizabeth all sparked deep psychological wounds. Was he being poisoned by his wives, his enemies in court? As his body rots, does Henry finally realize that it is not disease or time, but his own decisions that have condemned him to this slow death? By the time of his death in 1547, Henry VIII had become a tragic figure. His court was filled with scheming politicians, ambitious nobles, and power-hungry courtiers. He was a man betrayed by his own body and mind. His health had declined to the point where he could barely walk, and his decisions, once quick and decisive, became erratic and paranoid. Behind closed doors, Henry's court was rife with conspiracy. His ministers jockeyed for power, and his children, Mary and Elizabeth, now poised to rule, were kept at arm's length. Henry's death would leave an England on the brink of collapse, not just because of the instability of the throne, but because of the spiritual and political chaos he left behind. His fight to secure an heir led to a series of power struggles that would ripple through generations. Henry's last will, the shocking truth behind his succession. Who would inherit the throne after his passing? And what dirty secret did he leave hidden in his final breaths that could have altered England's future forever? In the end, Henry VIII wasn't killed by illness or old age. He was killed by himself, by his decisions, his obsession, his inability to reconcile his own mortality. His legacy is one of ambition unchecked, of power squandered, and of a king who never accepted the truth, that even he, the mighty Henry VIII, could not escape the passage of time. But the most horrifying part of his death wasn't the physical decay. It was the realization that the real tragedy was not his body, but the empire he left behind. The shadows of his reign would haunt England for centuries. And in the end, Henry's death became an afterthought, overshadowed by the triumph of his daughters and the dynasty he had never truly believed in. Imagine a king so powerful, his very name sends fear through Europe, now barely able to sit without the most excruciating pain. Henry VIII, the mighty monarch, trapped in his own flesh, dying slowly. But what if this physical torment wasn't the worst thing about him? We open on a gruesome scene, Henry's bloated body, leaking fluids from an untreated wound, the smell so foul that even his closest allies abandon him. As his coffin is sealed in the damp chapel, stray dogs lick at the fluid-drenched floor, as if to cleanse the remnants of what once was a king. But here's the twist. This moment is a lie. It wasn't just his body decaying, it was his soul. What if Henry VIII's greatest enemy was not his physical collapse, but a much more sinister plot hidden under the layers of his court? We jump back to 1536, the day of Henry's fateful jousting accident, a day that is always remembered for the king's fall. But what's hidden in the shadows of this accident is the real cause of his suffering. Was it simply an accident, or had dark forces been gathering around the king, ensuring that his body would break in such a way? The unholy alliance of his enemies, internal conspirators in his own court, might have had a hand in his suffering, as they saw the king's weakening state as their opportunity to destroy him. What if this injury was no accident at all? Could someone, maybe even within his own family, have engineered his downfall? Let's go beyond the physical symptoms. The king's wounds, those festering, rotting ulcers, didn't just plague his body. They ate at his mind too. The growing paranoia, was it born from the constant pain? Or did Henry start to see shadows where none existed? The unrelenting mental anguish of his decaying body pushed him to purge those closest to him. But Henry's decision-making deteriorated so drastically, it became a question of whether his mental stability had been compromised by forces beyond his control. Was he already manipulated by those who wanted to control him? Now, what about the hidden truths? Henry's court, his advisors, his ministers, even his wives were all watching closely, knowing full well that Henry was not the same king after his injury. But was the king's demise part of a larger strategy by his enemies? As his health faltered, so did his power. His once commanding presence was now weak and his decisions erratic. Did the king's suffering mask a larger conspiracy? His final brutal decision to execute Thomas More, his one-time advisor, came under strange circumstances, and Henry's decision to disinherit his son, Edward VI, and trust his throne to Elizabeth is wrapped in mystery. What happened to make him turn against the very bloodline he so desperately wanted to preserve? Who really benefited from Henry's decline? Was it Elizabeth, or was there something more to the rise of his daughter, a queen who would come to define the monarchy like no one before her? By the end of his life, Henry was not only a king in physical agony, he was a broken man. His health was failing, but his grip on power was slipping, and this bred an uncontrollable fear. Why did Henry VIII, the once feared king, live in constant fear of being poisoned? Was he truly paranoid, or was there a real plot to undermine his reign from within? As his body disintegrated, the power struggles within his court escalated. Advisors whispered in shadows, plotting the king's demise to gain power. Could the ultimate reason for Henry's fall lie in the fact that his mind, shattered by illness, made him vulnerable to manipulation? Was his final break a direct consequence of the deteriorating political landscape, or were his court conspirators plotting all along? By the time of Henry's death, the throne of England was no longer his, but the damage he left in his wake would shape the kingdom for generations to come. Who truly held the power in the final years of Henry VIII's reign? And how did Elizabeth of Verneur, his own daughter, rise from his ruins to take control of England? Was she simply the heir, or was she a mastermind in her own right? The story of Henry VIII's fall is only half the tale. What happens next will shock you. The greatest monarch in Europe, the king who defied Rome, who bent the laws of nature with his own will, died not from battle or assassination, but from the slow, torturous decay of his own body and mind. Once, Henry VIII was the very picture of vitality. Now he is a bloated corpse leaking fluids on a chapel floor, his closest allies licking the stink of his decay off the stone walls. This shock is meant to feel unnerving. Not only is the decay of the king exposed as physical rot, but it is also a metaphor for the decay of the kingdom itself. The once revered power of the crown is no longer a symbol of divine rule, but a putrid symbol of tyrannical fear. Set in the backdrop of 16th century England, Henry VIII's reign represents the dramatic clash between human pride and the bitter price of power. By 1536, Henry was a king who had once commanded respect through his good looks, strength, and political acumen. He reigned supreme, not only as a monarch but as the protector of the church in England. But that was before the ghosts of his past wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, came back to haunt him. The world Henry ruled would soon become a place of terrifying isolation. Anne's execution was a death sentence to his sanity. Once Henry realized the price of his choices, his break with Rome, the destruction of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, he turned inward. The deaths of his wives weren't just political failures, they were personal betrayals. These betrayals fractured Henry's belief in God's favor, sending him into a nosedive. In January 1536, everything changes. At a jousting tournament, Henry's horse collapses beneath him, sending him into unconsciousness for hours. The spectacle of the once immaculate king lying in a heap of blood and bone is only the beginning. The king who had once been feared for his athleticism and immense physical presence now finds himself a shadow of his former self. His wound festers, an ulcerous, pus-filled, rot-ridden leg that no one can seem to heal. His decay is visible, the weight gain, the inability to move, the stench. This injury isn't just physical, it's a betrayal of everything he once embodied. But this injury is more than just a source of pain. It marks a turning point. This physical ailment makes Henry vulnerable, not just to disease, but to those around him who see his weakness as an opportunity. As his body decays, his mind fractures, making him a more dangerous ruler, one prone to irrational decisions and bloody purges. By 1537, Henry's once charismatic persona is lost. His paranoia takes root. But the decay of his body is nothing compared to the decay of his mind. Could it have been the untreated syphilis, the untreated wounds that spread not only infection but insanity? We know that Henry grew more suspicious, but few understand the depth of his psychological turmoil. The truth behind his late purges becomes chilling. Was Henry's fear of death and obsession with immortality the reason he ordered the executions of men like Thomas More and Henry Howard? Could the court itself have manipulated Henry's paranoia, feeding his delusions of conspiracy and betrayal? The collapse of the king. It's 1547 and Henry VIII, the Golden Prince, the man who defied Rome and built the Church of England, is no longer the vibrant figure that once stood as the symbol of strength and authority. His rotting leg is not the only sign of his decline. He is a man unable to control even his own body, trapped in the very thing he feared most: weakness. His court, once filled with courtiers who trembled at his command, now shudders at his grotesque appearance and the stench of death that follows him. But here's the most shocking part. Was it the disease that defeated Henry, or was it something far darker, something his court, and perhaps even his closest advisors, may have used against him? Contemporaries speak of the rotting king, but what they don't tell you is that Henry's condition was deliberately worsened by his own refusal to seek the best treatment. His fear of surgery, a king so obsessed with his masculinity that he could not bear the thought of being reduced to a cripple, may have sealed his fate. But what if there were those who saw his condition as an opportunity? As Henry lies in agony, unable to walk or sit, one question hangs in the air. Who stands to gain the most from his suffering? And were there those around him plotting not just his physical demise, but his psychological destruction as well? It's not just about Henry's physical agony. His mental state, ravaged by pain, paranoia, and isolation, begins to alienate even his most trusted allies. His former allies turn into enemies, and whispers fill the air. Would anyone dare to help him now? Or did his court, the very men who should have been his support, begin to whisper among themselves about the future of England, wondering if this would be the moment to take control? What role did his ministers, particularly Thomas Cranmer and the Seymours, play during Henry's final years? Were they looking out for England's future, or were they simply waiting for the king's death to seize power? Historians now suggest that syphilis, compounded by diabetes, gout, and hypertension, could explain the rapid deterioration of Henry's body and mind. But there's a darker side to this diagnosis. Henry's refusal to acknowledge his illness led to life-threatening complications. How much of Henry's paranoia was driven by the illness, and how much by the mounting pressure of his failures? As Henry's power wanes, the monarchy itself begins to crack. The decisions he made, his disastrous foreign policies, his bloody purges, the destruction of his marriages, start to make sense not just as the acts of a king, but the acts of a man trying desperately to hold on to something that was slipping through his fingers. The deepest shock, however, is that Henry VIII never fully lost control. He just refused to see the signs that his power was never his to begin with. So did Henry's physical decline lead to his downfall, or was it something much more sinister? Was the collapse of the king also the collapse of the entire structure he created, a regime built on violence, fear, and control? And more importantly, who was there, in the shadows, waiting to pick up the pieces? The aftermath, the horrifying end and legacy. What happens when a king who once ruled with iron fists, tearing apart his kingdom to suit his whims, finally faces the inevitable? A swollen, diseased corpse, a legacy in ruins. But Henry VIII's death isn't just about his body rotting. It's the death of everything he thought he controlled, and no one saw it coming. It's January 1547. Henry VIII in his final hours is not a king. He is a man in agony, chained to a body that can no longer obey his will. His body, once the embodiment of strength, is now a ball of festering sores and swelling. His legs, ravaged by gout, are unrecognizable, gangrene spreading throughout his flesh. Every breath is laborious, and each movement is more painful than the last. The same man who once commanded the lives of thousands now struggles to utter a single word. Henry's death isn't a peaceful passing. He's too far gone to even recognize the faces around him. His most trusted advisors watch helplessly as the king's mind shatters. Was his death a release, or was it a final punishment for years of torment? As the life drains from his body, his last moments are filled with madness. The king who was once feared by all now dies like a broken man. But what happened to Henry's body after death? Was the treatment of his remains truly the final insult to his rule? The rumors that spread around his embalming process reveal something even darker. Why did his coffin leak fluid in the tomb? Was this the body of a king, or a rotting symbol of a failed empire? As Henry's corpse is prepared for burial, his death represents more than the end of a man. It marks the beginning of a new horrifying chapter for England. His reign had been one of absolute terror, filled with paranoia and executions. But after his death, the political landscape is thrown into chaos. Henry VIII's death creates a power vacuum that leads directly to England's near destruction. His son, Edward VI, is crowned king, but as a child his reign is easily manipulated by others. The whole nation is in turmoil as factions vie for control, each one more dangerous than the last. Yet from this chaos, the ultimate irony emerges. Elizabeth I, daughter of this tyrant, will rise from these ashes to become one of England's most powerful and enduring monarchs. But how did Elizabeth survive the court of her tyrannical father and rise to power? What secrets did she inherit from a court that was riddled with conspiracies and betrayal? But what if Elizabeth's reign wasn't simply a product of fate? What if her entire ascension was the result of carefully crafted manipulations behind the scenes, involving figures who'd once served Henry VIII? What did Elizabeth learn from the corruption that ate at her father's soul? And what dark strategies did she use to ensure her own survival? As Henry's body is laid to rest, the story of his reign is far from over. His physical decay and political collapse are a testament to the fragility of power. No matter how mighty, no ruler is immune to the passage of time or the inevitable decay of the body. But what does this tell us about the nature of power? Henry VIII built an empire on fear and violence, but in the end, he couldn't control even his own body. His death raises a question that echoes through history. Is it possible to truly hold on to power forever? Can anyone like Henry truly cheat the final judgment of time? Or are all rulers doomed to the same fate, a reckoning in their final hours? And what about the men and women who remain after such a colossal fall? What happens when the empire left behind is built on lies, betrayal, and fear? Can anyone escape the shadows of a dead king's legacy, or is it an eternal stain on history's pages? What happens when a king, once invincible, is reduced to a bloated corpse, rotting away in front of his court? What was the final, gut-wrenching truth behind Henry VIII's last moments that history has kept hidden? His death didn't just mark the end of a man, but the unraveling of everything he fought to build. You won't believe what came next. Subscribe now, turn on the notification button to witness the shocking revelations that could rewrite everything you thought you knew about the death of a king.